get started on our first panel on sort of rule of law. The term like rule of law has been in vogue in sort of recent years and is seen as the bedrock of liberal market-based democracies. But what it means, and especially how to achieve this goal, is of course anything but simple. I mean, one possible framework which I use in my own work is to think of it in terms of a supply chain. It begins with laws, then continues to the investigative and enforcement agencies, like the police, then the prosecutorial arm, and then the judicial arm, and finally the penal part of this supply chain. Now, ever since the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution, the questions about property and broader questions of sort of legitimacy, simplicity, and the practicality of laws, all of it seem rather obvious, but they have not really been the hallmark of the legal and the legislative frameworks that have been put into place since sort of independence. It is not just that many laws are outdated or the new ones are often very poorly drafted, but they tend to be very proscriptive and prescriptive, and without much regard to the broader institutional context of incentives and enforcement capabilities of the Indian state. You can pass a law on child marriage and say that we now ban child marriage. If you look at the Indian census, there were more than 10 million child marriages. The number of prosecutions was barely 100, convictions was barely 10. Now, of course, you can ban people from walking across the street, and you can stop 5 people if they are crossing. You can't stop when there are 50,000 people that are crossing. So unless you look at the underlying incentive structures and the broader social base on which these things take place, just passing these laws makes very little sense. So I think just some questions which I hope our panelists will give some thought to. How do we move from rule by law to rule of law? The second, which of course comes up repeatedly about, is who guards the guardians. We normally think of the politicians who draft the laws, but I think there are larger questions if you think of property laws. What are the incentives actually like for lawyers to actually settle disputes fast? If you get paid by the number of appearances rather than actually on the settlement of a case, it's your incentive is to continue to try and postpone and postpone and postpone. There's no incentive to actually settle the case. The police actually have a faster incentive to settle property disputes because they get paid off by both sides to try and settle. And then looking forward, what really do our panelists think can be done in the immediate future? What are some low-hanging fruits that can be plucked? But more broadly, how over the longer run do we move from a very legalistic approach to an approach that is based more on incentives and norms? And as Rajiv said, how do we go about in the long run to rebuilding trust between the state and the productive sort of agents of the Indian economy? So we'll move now to our 2 very knowledgeable panelists. We have Anirudh Burman of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and Mukesh Gulati, who is the Executive Director of the Foundation of MSME Clusters. Anirudh, you want to start?
I'm going to be focusing on systemic changes for creating a regulatory state, and we've been discussing the issue of more effective regulation, better regulation, more transparency. And what I'm going to claim is that we are not going to get significantly better regulation without creating some sort of a institutional change in the governance mechanisms, in the way state agencies are incentivized and equipped to perform their regulatory functions. So I'm going to run through the first two parts, which is how do we think about rule of law, what are the commonly understood definitions, and then talk in detail about where we stand in India and what we can do. So the many uniformly accepted definitions which talk about absence of arbitrariness, independent adjudication, separation of powers, some consultative process in decision making, more legal certainty. And there's this very simply written, really great book called Rule of Law by Lord Bingham, a judge in the UK, who lists and explains 8 principles of rule of law, 8 key aspects of rule of law. So I'm going to talk about 3 of them in particular because I thought those are the most pertinent for our discussion today. One is accessibility of law. How does the government or the state communicate what a law is and what it means and what the consequences of the law are? So there are some laws or some crimes in society which are fairly easily understandable. You know you cannot commit murder, you cannot commit robbery. But what is insider trading? I mean, it's a far grayer line to understand than murder and robbery. At the same time, if you move to a market economy, you are going to get more and more insider trading. So you have an obligation to make people understand what they can and cannot do. That is one core component of a rule of law society. The second part is legal certainty. And that also comes from an absence of arbitrariness. You cannot change rules and laws overnight. There has to be some sort of a deliberative process. People have to be explained what things are going to mean, what their consequences are, and the degree of applicability to different kinds of individuals. The second is a lack of discretion. Laws should aim to minimize discretion, and this is mainly because there are errors of both omission and commission in the working of state agencies. And when a government agency wields coercive power, these errors are costly. So it is one thing for the Constitution to say government will act in public interest. But what does public interest mean when you are writing a law to prevent, say, foreign direct investment in a particular field? Is public interest going to be defined more clearly, more elaborately when we are talking about FDI, tax, and is it different from, say, a murder trial? Right? The other problem is laws which confer excessive discretion. So if you look at the Companies Act 2013, one of the main criticisms was that there are more than 200 sections under which the central government can make rules. And this means that how the law applies to you can change far more dynamically than it would if a parliamentary law gave you less powers to write rules. Right? The third component is that of a fair trial. Now, we typically think of trials in the context of court disputes, but there's a large part of quasi-judicial administrative proceedings happening every day, where you are basically up against the state in some capacity or the other. The state has more power than you. The state often has more information than you. So modern public administration talks about the importance of quasi-judicial decisions being made independently, being made impartially, and the respondent being given as much information as possible about the conduct of the trial. Now let's see where India stands on a lot of these aspects. By and large, we retain some trappings of a socialist state, where private activity in the economy was much lower than what it is today. Therefore, rules continue to be made by government, and they are made in formats and through processes which are understandable only to the government. People who deal with these issues daily understand them better, but by and large, the public has a low understanding of regulatory instruments, the context of those instruments, and why rules are being made or changed. Rules are made arbitrarily without a consultative process being followed. The rationale for why rules are being changed are not explained. Often rules lack specificity. We go back to the public interest example, which basically leads to different outcomes in the interpretation of the same rules in different cases. And importantly, quasi-judicial rules or quasi-judicial processes suffer from these same problems, which is you do not have a sufficient degree of specificity in or clarity in what the quasi-judicial process is going to be, what likely outcomes are going to result from the process, and what your rights and obligations are. So what it is creating is, ideally public administration and the rule of law should create monotonous outcomes. In 9 cases out of 10, you should get the same result if you are a similarly placed individual to someone else with a similar problem. However, in India, you get a huge amount of variance. Right? So the same process is applied to different people in different ways, creating different outcomes, and it becomes difficult to ensure the rule of law. Now, I'm just taking one example from one regulator which I followed directly. This is a recent RBI order on July 10th. Basically, the order is 2 paragraphs long, one very long paragraph and one very short paragraph. The order basically says that directions have been given to so-and-so bank. It basically prevents it from opening new branches. Now, the contents of the order, let's look at what the rule of law really implies here. RBI does not publish its orders on the website, it only publishes press releases about the website. It states the name of the respondent and it states what the bank can and cannot do. It does not state a lot of things that you would expect in a good rule of law framework. It does not talk about what the relevant facts were, what was the alleged misconduct of the bank, and other banks cannot therefore understand what they are supposed to do and what they are not supposed to do. It does not talk about what investigation was conducted, what were the findings. It does not provide the evidence or discuss the evidence. It does not give any reason by reasoning of the person issuing the order. It does not provide any details of the defense provided by the bank, and it does not give the name of the authority issuing the order. So, and this is a fairly routine practice among regulators. Some regulators are much better, some regulators are like this, and some regulators are much worse. Some other features. One recurring problem is the multiplicity of instruments. We do not understand what different regulatory instruments mean, what their binding value is, and which we are supposed to follow. So you have regulations, circulars, press releases, guidelines. So for example, if you look at the FDI sector, the FDI policy is where the government comes out with this policy, but the FDI policy is implemented by issuing regulations under FEMA. So the RBI is actually the authority which writes the FDI regulations, right? And yet the FDI policy is somehow taken as binding by a lot of market participants. So there's complete chaos in which instrument is binding, which I am supposed to follow. The second is a lack of transparency of process. There is no explanation for why a process is being made, why a right or an obligation is being created or taken away. There is no commitment to service delivery times. The approval rejection processes are opaque and again suffer from a lack of specificity. The rights and obligations of applicants and respondents are not communicated. And the third, and again critical aspect is there is still a lack of sufficient independence in quasi-judicial processes. The person who is conducting some sort of prosecution against you is very much a part of the agency without having even a minor degree of insulation from the rest of the agency. So the investigative wing and the prosecutorial wing is basically the same, right? And if you saw these characteristics being played out in the normal judiciary, you'd be horrified. And yet a large degree of rights, obligations are being created and destroyed in this way every day. Now, how do you create a regulatory state? Like Professor Kapoor was saying, a state has 3 functions: legislative, executive, and judiciary, and it maintains a separation of powers. A regulatory state has to mimic this design. It has a government regulation making role, an executive role, and a judicial role. Now, all of these 3 have to be independent. The rule of law has to pervade all of these 3 functions. Now, regulation making has to be empirical, it has to be precise, it has to be consultative and prospective. When we come to the executive and judicial roles, it's very important that due process requirements are given much more details. For example, we use the phrase requirements of natural justice, I mean, as a throwaway line. But what does natural justice mean in specific cases? Is natural justice in the context of getting a driving license issued the same as natural justice in a murder trial? I mean, any reasonable man would say, no, they're different. But the same phrase is used in very different scenarios where the rights and obligations of parties are going to be affected. So you have to create details about what does natural justice mean in a specific situation. How am I going to give the other party a hearing? What are the rights and obligations? Am I going to take written statements, oral hearings? What degree of oral hearings? And related to this is one large tendency of public administration over the last few years where we create special tribunals and we say these are exempted from civil procedure because the civil procedure is very onerous, it takes a lot of time, and these agencies will have 9 or 10-page rule books. Now, I would say that you curb discretion and you help processes along by actually writing more rules. If you compare the US Securities Exchange Commission, their enforcement manual is about 144,000 words. The Debt Recovery Tribunal in India is 10 pages long, right? So there is a necessity to create more law to minimize discretion in many cases. So this broadly requires some sort of performance-based norms for accountability, a clear statement of objectives for government agencies, a huge degree of standardization of regulatory instruments, greater focus on due process and transparency, and some empirical approach to regulation making. Now, what I'm positing is that political change does not ensure this kind of a systemic change. And secondly, none of this is new. The US solved a lot of these problems in the 1940s and 50s. Many other OECD countries have done this over the last 30, 40 years. So all of it can be done. The principal instrument people have used to do all of this is to enact laws which provide for some sort of a public administration framework. Which brings me to the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission and its work. It provided its report in 2013 at the end of a 2-year process. And the objective of the commission was to take a look at the entire financial sector legal landscape and propose a holistic change to the way the system was working. After 2 years, the commission proposed a single law to repeal about 60 financial sector laws and to replace it with one Indian financial code. Now, the key learning was that the rule of law has to actually pervade the internal processes and systems of government agencies for it to actually translate into greater ease of doing business. So about 1/3 or more than 1/3 of the Indian financial code is actually public administration. Very broadly, it follows the same theory that independent regulators are many states, the objectives must be clearly defined, participants should have clear legal obligations, and there has to be a balance between autonomy and independence. When we come to lawmaking, which is regulation, the draft IFC says there's a single regulation making instrument called regulations. The process of writing them has to be finalized by the board. Documents along with draft regulations have to be released which talk about the costs and benefits of the regulations and the rationale for them. And there is a procedure for internal review. Executive functions have to be rule bound. They have to be written in the bylaws of all government agencies. The types of notices, the types of communication that goes out to market participants is being clearly defined. The types of inspections that can be conducted, the notices that participants require before an inspection can be conducted is defined. And there are either clear time limits placed or an obligation on the regulator to place a time limit for its functions. Interestingly, for judicial functions, the draft financial code creates a judicial wing of administrative law officers inside every regulator who will undertake only the imposition of penalties, fines, the revocation of licenses. They'll be supervised exclusively by a member of the board. There has to be a detailed legal process for all notices and orders. appeals go to the appellate tribunal, and the tribunal will also have the power to review irregularities in the regulation making process. To conclude, a lot of these proposals and a lot of these designs are applicable to other sectors. For example, minimum contents of notices, regulation making processes. Now, political change, unlike the way we think about it, is neither a necessary condition nor is it sufficient in itself to ensure systemic changes in public administration. And you have to organize or reorganize institutions with rule of law principles. And the way to do it is to create a new body of administrative law that is more consumer centric.
I requested if I could speak more on the practitioner's perspective of the micro, small, medium enterprises. Let me begin with what I understand of the MSMEs, and most of you must be familiar with this. The micro, small, medium enterprises, there is no threshold limit of what is the investment which is required to be called a micro enterprise. So you can even start with a zero balance and say that I'm a micro enterprise. But there are definitions by the government which essentially are separating the micro, the small and the medium enterprises, and the maximum level is considered to be 10 crores of investment in plant and machinery only and not in land and building. Which essentially, if we sort of compare in the various types of MSMEs, bulk of them are essentially very small ones. And if we essentially say that, if you were to put a hand on what a micro small enterprise looks like, it's a mom and pop store next to your neighborhood, which is probably about 36% of all the enterprises. And then there are many who are handloom and handicraft producers, which would also be a very big number. But essentially, when we are looking at very small of these enterprises, probably 95% of all the enterprises are called unregistered enterprises. Unregistered, they are not registered with any authority. So the rule is that the registration is an aberration and a non-registration is a rule. But the way the government defines what is a formal sector and an informal sector, or a registered and an unregistered sector, it essentially looks at it purely from its own internal perspective and say that if I have created a law and if you are registered under that, you are under the formal sector and rest of them are all under the informal sector. So this is also a big aberration because this is not following the norm or the law, but it's actually following the aberration. If you are essentially looking at the numbers, they are very big. They are 47 million enterprises, which means 4.7 crores, according to the Ministry of MSME Statistics. And more than 10 crore of people are employed in it. So if you just try and look at these two figures, which I just mentioned, what is the average size of an enterprise? A little more than 2. So that essentially means that most of the enterprises are basically a single person driven enterprise. And I could give you a typical example of a kite maker sitting at home making kites and then selling it in the evening on the pavement. How do they work? So if I say that 99% of these enterprises are essentially micro enterprises, how do they actually work? How do they function? Most of the laws which are applicable to the large, the medium, the small are also applicable to the micro enterprises. So that means the first thing is that they are supposed to know what the various laws they are supposed to abide by. And how many there are laws? Honestly, I've been in this business for about 25 years. I don't know. So a kite maker is also not expected to therefore know about what these rules or laws are. And that, you said, is the first requirement to follow what is called rule of law, that there must be an awareness, a knowledge that yes, this is something which is required. And when I was looking at this ease of doing business of the World Bank Group, it's essentially measuring through the 11 indicators. And India stands, I think, at 140 out of 189. This is what was stated also in the previous session. So when we are looking at how these laws are actually implemented, It's basically the norms or the trust on which most of these enterprises essentially function. Because if I sell you a good and I'm supposed to get the money back, or if there is a problem in the contract enforcement, people would essentially measure whether it's worth it to go to the court to get this done or not. And if it is going to take 8 years, might as well close the unit and stop the business there. If that be the case, then one thing that you can essentially say is that there is uniformity, that whether you follow the laws or you do not follow the laws, the uniformity is that you still have to pay. You may have to pay a little less, but you may have to pay a little more. That being the difference. Now, if you are looking at financing, for example, which is one of the components of the access to finance as the ease of doing business, 5% of all enterprises in the MSME sector have access to formal finance, which means they have access to loans from the banks. 95% of them don't. And why is it so? The more we are looking at the various committees which have been set up in the last, I don't know, for 30, 40 years, which are essentially saying that greater access of loans must be there to the micro or small enterprises. They are increasingly saying about need for what is called incrementalist approach. So they're saying, okay, so far 100,000 enterprises have loans, so we have to make harder effort in order to ensure that this number increases by at least 20% in the next 2 years. And so the more we are sort of going up at this incremental approach, the more we are realizing that the numbers are swelling and the percentage remains either the same, which is the 5% which have the access to the loans, and the rest of them don't, and that percentage sort of continues to remain the same. Then there are also issues of what is called incentive systems of the government, which are there to support these micro or small enterprises to grow better. Are you aware how many schemes of assistance exist in India at the central government only, not the state governments, which the micro, small, medium enterprises can take advantage of? 205. So if you look at what is called, if you look at a website which is called www.clusterobservatory.in, then on the top right hand corner you will find schemes. And there's not just one ministry, which is Ministry of MSME, but there are 8 ministries which are providing these plethora of schemes which are available to them. So some schemes are applicable to individual enterprises, some to groups. Some which are applicable to one sector, the other one to another sector. There are some schemes which are applicable to only technology, the others only to promote financing, others only to skill development, and so on and so forth. So the numbers are huge. So we had to basically work out a system of identifying that if you want to know which of these 205 schemes, there should be an app which should be available on your phone or maybe on the website, so that you can say, I am an individual interested in a scheme which is related to skill development, and I only need something which is relevant to this sector, so that you can come down to maybe a few numbers that you can essentially go into. There are then a lots of, if one goes into the history of how the MSMEs have been supported, since 1954 onwards, the government has created a large number of institutions which probably run into more than 1,000, which are essentially supposed to provide a range of assistance to these enterprises. So some institution will provide skill development, some will work as a tool room, which will provide dies, tools, jigs and fixtures to the enterprises that are unable to get from the private sector. And there was lots of assistance initially which was provided in terms of even input provision, saying that if you need coal, the government will provide you at a subsidized rate. If you need steel, the government will provide you at a subsidized rate, and so on and so forth. All this stopped in the year 1991 when we had one transformation of liberalization. But thereafter also, if you look at the schemes, there are lot of them which have now come up, which are essentially asking the enterprises to get together and start their own systems of assisting themselves. So this is one way. The other way is to promote what is called market-based systems. So if there are supposed to be good service providers, these service providers need to be there in the market which can assist these small enterprises to do their job better. There are no schemes which are essentially there to help the private sector associations or groups of enterprises to strengthen their capacities so that they can then become the service providers themselves. And then if you essentially look at those kind of schemes of assistance which are more enabling in terms of strengthening the markets to do their job better, there are problems. Now, there are certain things that the markets can do best. There are certain things that the government can do best in terms of regulation and its enforcement. And then there are certain quasi-institutions. And probably if I was to conclude, I would essentially say that if in such a huge heterogeneous sector of MSMEs, where there are supposed to be 10,000 clusters across the country, then it is not possible that everything that is provided from the governmental platform can be and needs to be what is called a homogeneous one. So there are certain laws, regulations and their enforcement which essentially needs to be uniform. But then there are lots of service deliveries which need to be very heterogeneous, directly meeting the needs of these sort of groups of enterprises. And therefore, one thing that we can essentially do is, and need to do is to first keep the information updated on what actually is the status of the sector. When I said 47 million enterprises, you might be surprised that in 2006-07 there was a census which was conducted in which the number was stated to be 26 million enterprises, which was also a kind of projection. And now when we are talking about this 47, this is a projection on that projection. So that means if you do not have necessarily the information of what is happening where, which particular subsector is dying, which one is growing well, you can't make service delivery systems, you can't create institutions, you can't have enforcement systems which are basically in the thin air with your own projections that you know how this projection will lead to that projection. The second, of course, is very importantly that we need to move away from what is called incrementalist approach to transformational approach. Something that you mentioned about looking at the entire plethora of laws and rules and then saying that these need to be repealed, this need to be put under one set and then move on. The Ministry of MSME essentially delivers from a paternalistic point of view lots of schemes, and there are many others also. But there are no systems which are necessarily available which you can put your hand on and say that if an enterprise is not able to get its change of land use, what is the role of the Ministry of MSME in this? That connection is completely missing. So a regulator and what is called a benefactor or the one who is providing these kind of schemes are completely disjointed, never connected with one another. Then there are 8 central government ministries which are also not talking to one another. And only when there used to be a planning commission that the scheme which was drafted by one ministry used to be sent there, which was then circulated through a mechanical route and then it came back with some changes and all that. And finally, there are lots of well-meaning laws, but let's understand that when 99% of the enterprises are essentially micro, there is a lot which needs to be worked upon, what is called trust, norms and relationships, and not just by what is written in the rule book and the law book. And if this has to be factored in our system, then an intent clearance is far more important, and the institutions need to be created at local level, which essentially can deliver this at the local level. And the government itself, when it has done many things good and many things not very good, there needs to be what is called an knowledge backbone system inside the government itself, so that it can learn from its own systems and then at least continue to develop that. And this is also something which has been completely missing, and we are just sort of ending up with more and more audit-friendly schemes rather than MSME-friendly schemes of assistance. Thank you.
India has one of the most comprehensive laws on environment, and recently we were told that Delhi is the most polluted city in the world. We have one of the very comprehensive law on corruption, but Transparency International tells us we are one of the ranking in the lowest level of most corrupt nations. Even right to information law, if we see, like, we have got one of the most comprehensive law on right to information, but it is not easy to access. Like, for just 10 rupees, NGT fights with the applicant and pays about 34,000 rupees. Now, because the session is on rule of law, and I'm a lawyer myself, IPR lawyer, but is it really helping us by creating more and more laws? Is really making more laws helping India?
I think there are two parts to it. One is you need some substantive laws in society. You need an environmental protection law. You need a IPC, and you need your substantive laws. What is really missing is, are the procedural parts of the law detailed enough? Are they specific enough? Has someone thought out how the nuances of the law going to be implemented? Now, for example, prevention of corruption. You have elaborate institutional mechanisms, the CVC, the CAG, you have a lot of mechanisms, but what is the precise legal objective of each institution? What are the 300 pages of procedures the CVC, the CAG are going to follow if something goes wrong? That is missing. If you look at, so just to give one very short example, there was about a year ago an issue of whether private discoms can be audited by CAG, and the High Court weighed in and said, yes, the CAG can. And so I looked at the US counterpart and their regulations. They have a separate 80-page manual on the auditing of discoms. So rule of law is sometimes bettered by more detailed processes, by actually thinking about how to legally define what a process and a system is going to be.
What laws do you think should not be there to help the micro enterprises, micro or small?
I think more important is the enforcement part. There are laws which are well-meaning, whether they are related to labor or their environment or pollution, but the enforcement is a major issue.
Can you illustrate?
Those of you who are familiar with the MSMEs, IIT Delhi and Ministry of Environment and Forest some 3-4 years ago came up with a study report in which they ranked 85 cities which are performing very poorly in terms of their pollution levels. And Vapi and Ankleshwar at that point of time in Gujarat came to be the worst one. And this was all based upon what is called statistical data, which is available with the Ministry of Environment and Forest through Central Pollution Control Board and through State Pollution Control Boards. Why did it happen when there are rules, laws available? Why did it end up there when there are emission norms available for the air, when there is a water emission system which is available? And this is the data which is again with the government. So what is it that is holding the government in controlling that? What are the kind of institutions which are existing and supposed to be doing this job and were not doing it? This is an example that you can possibly look at in terms of its linkage. If you also look at the labor laws and you just go around 100 factories, just any 100 factories, how many of them are using personal protective equipment that they are supposed to be using? How many of them are actually following what is called this insurance systems of the ESI and Public Provident Fund and the Social Security systems? Probably 97% won't be, 3% would be. So there are systems available by which you can actually move out. I think it's some issue of more of an enforcement, and since there are a number of laws, if they can be more clarified in terms of intent and put together so that there is one thing which enables you to then run this or implement it, that would be much better. But I am not speaking from the lawyer's perspective because this is not my area. I am purely speaking from the practitioner's perspective.
Both of you have focused at the central government level, so implicitly. But most of the enforcement, especially of the sort which you're talking about, is at the state government level.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share with us the limitations of your argument, given that most of the issues about implementation really lie at subnational levels rather than at the national level?
One obvious constraint which comes to mind is that the capacity to implement and enforce is obviously much weaker at the state level. And counterintuitively, the process of decentralization should actually help better monitoring and enforcement if you develop these capacities at the state level. So, for example, the Food Safety Authority, a large part of its monitoring and implementation is actually at the state level, which is one reason why you are arguably seeing better enforcement than in some other sectors. So that's one part of it, the state capacity question. How do you create enough resources and enough skills to enforce laws properly? But even again, in the field of administrative functioning and law, we haven't paid sufficient attention. If the central government has still created some mechanisms to try and develop better capacity, better monitoring, better accountability mechanisms. But the states are by and large lagging behind. There is some attempt at revamp of how the annual confidential reports of bureaucrats are going to be written, of creating some sort of monitoring mechanism inside the PMO. But at the state level, that is still far away as far as I know.
I think we have too heavy a state, at least when we are looking at this micro, small, medium enterprise sector. If we believe that the enforcement is going to be done by the state alone, not feasible. There are international models which are available, which essentially state very clearly that you have what is called a self-regulation system, and a self-regulation system where there are public-private partnerships which are feasible to take it forward. And once you reach a threshold that when this is not working, then the heavy hand of the government essentially comes in. So this, what is called enforcement and what is called incentivization, needs to be linked. And then we need to involve local institutions, particularly the associations of the small enterprises, or we can have the local academic institutions to be a part of this system so as to take it forward.
According to the panel, is law the biggest impediment to creating institutions that work? Because to my mind, institutions are made up of more than just laws and regulations and policies.
Law is used as a device to constrain the behavior of individuals, and the same principle applies to government officials as well. They're subject to the same prejudices, whims, and arbitrariness as we are. So you design law to ensure that a particular outcome is generated through the compliance of a particular process. So a well-defined law or a well-drafted law would at least give you that basic modicum, that there is some due process, there is some communication about rights and obligations to all market participants, and so that the outcome is more or less uniform and consistent in a large percentage of cases.
To the issue of enforcement that we were discussing right now, in India the enforcement mostly means more of an inspector Raj kind of thing. So be it your food safety, be it education, everywhere enforcement basically means that inspectors go, they inspect, there's corruption, bribery, etc. And that's why the laws generally don't work. That's where the issue is. So what would be a solution if, to this? I mean, what could be an alternate model? Basically more a principle-based approach or a more incentive-based approach? That's my question.
So you're right, but if you see recent developments soon after the NDA government came to power, the new inspection system for the Factories Act compliances and some of the labor law compliances, they are based completely on a risk-based inspection system. So there is a regular filing requirement and there is some random inspection, and then you are subjected to heightened supervision based on your degree of compliance or non-compliance. So you are moving slowly towards a system where inspections become more risk-based, more scientific, and that's in the future that's going to be a good, useful tool towards the end of license Raj. If you look at most advanced economies, everybody's moved more or less to risk-based inspection systems, and I think what we are really missing is adoption of similar systems by government departments across the board. The other part is that we are not really attuned to a regulatory system where the government is in the business of monitoring and supervision. The usual approach is to have a very high entry barrier and then forget about the people who get licenses. So you have to actually think about reorienting, lowering entry barriers, and then have much better inspection and supervision systems. And that requires some sort of investment in how the state organizes itself. Law is used as a device to constrain the behavior of individuals, and the same principle applies to government officials as well. They're subject to the same prejudices, whims, and arbitrariness as we are. So you design law to ensure that a particular outcome is generated through the compliance of a particular process. So a well-defined law or a well-drafted law would at least give you that basic modicum that there is some due process, there is some communication about rights and obligations to all market participants, and so that the outcome is more or less uniform and consistent in a large percentage of cases.
Which is, how do we move beyond just thinking about the content of the law as opposed to how it's actually applied? And this really is the broader and much more difficult question about the staffing of the public institutions. How do you recruit? How do you motivate? How do you weed out the non-performers? The internal organizations and processes of everything from a district court to a Supreme Court, all of those are much harder questions about public institutions themselves, which goes beyond the writ of this panel. So we're going to end it here. Thank you both.